All right, hello and welcome back to At the Symposium. I know it's been a while, but so is the case for many of my other videos. But I have some good news here. I am going to be tuning in a little bit more often, so I'm going to shoot for once a week on Sundays. I'll be coming in, and part of that is because I want to take an even deeper dive into some philosophical topics, so we'll be covering a lot of things in more detail, which is part of what we're going to do today here. I'm going to present a couple books, about 13 books in postmodernism that we'll talk about. But another announcement is also, if you've seen some of the recent videos on the channel that don't have to do with academia necessary or philosophy or anything in the humanities, it might be math related or aviation related or STEM related. Well, if you've seen some of my previous videos, I've talked about this before. I've been in the process of starting a STEM educational program here at my farm, and that is, coming to fruition. So I will be posting videos having to do with mathematics and science and all that kind of stuff, primarily on a different platform, but the symposium really shares the same kind of content, because it's all inclusive here. So it's math is just as much as philosophy and all the rest of the humanities. Even though this channel will focus mostly on the humanities, the symposium is really just about education in general. So if you're seeing those videos, don't let it throw you off or be alarmed. If you're not interested, that's fine. I basically put a lot of those videos up, especially having to do with math, just for access for students that are looking for that, because part of the symposium is also a tutoring service, right? So it's really just about access. It might not be as intellectually engaging to, look at pre-algebra, but that's okay. That's not what you're here for. That's not for you. But there's other things for you, like this, perhaps. So today we're going to be talking about postmodernism. I've talked about it briefly in a couple of my other videos. I talked about actually how I tend not to want to talk about the topic because I spend so much time talking about the topic and studying the topic. It's actually a very pertinent topic today, and a very popular topic. There's a lot of intellectual engagement about this because of the fact that it's kind of permeated, just general culture and mainstream culture, and there's a lot of spaces on the internet and a lot of speakers that talk about it as well now, because it's become kind of more pervasive, kind of more mainstream. It's made its way outside of the academy and is filtered through the rest of society. So it's a very pertinent thing. It's pretty much the most pertinent philosophy that's come out of the 20th century, filtering now into the 21st century, the first quarter of the 21st century. It's a major, major deal. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to showcase about 13 books that some are an introduction to postmodern philosophy, and others are a critique of postmodern philosophy. I have a batch here that are critique in a scientific way, and then I have a couple that are a critique in a theological way. Okay, so there's different camps and different disciplines that tackle the issues of postmodernism, not just philosophy. You have scientists that tackle it, and you have theologians that tackle it as well, because again, it's been so pervasive and so problematic in general that people have, from all kind of different fields, have tackled the issue of postmodernism. I'm not going to go into describing what postmodernism is. This is what I want you to do. Again, I will go into deeper detail in other videos, but here I'm just laying the groundwork for you to do your own due diligence and just showcase some good content having to do with postmodernism and getting an understanding of it. If you're looking for how to get an understanding of it, these are some great books that'll get you to be able to do that. So the first one actually is a book called An Introduction to Postmodernism, or just Postmodernism, a short introduction. These short introduction books are made by the Oxford Press. They're really good books. Again, I encourage you to pick up any of these kind of copies if you just want like a short overview of any kind of discipline. They have it all the way, from Buddhism to probably, to Christianity, to nothingness, to existentialism, to art, whatever category and subcategory of a discipline. They have these books available in them. So I'm going to show you two. This is the Introduction to Postmodernism. This will give you this will give you some history in it too, and it'll give you some of the ideas and some of the main figures, okay? Next one is post-structuralism. A short introduction. Oxford Press, same deal. Now, post-structuralism is really the philosophy that comes kind of before postmodernism, but is kind of the springboard of which postmodernism comes from. So before post-structuralism, you could say that philosophy had a structuralist kind of makeup, meaning that it shot for more objective means at which to categorize and speak of reality, where post-structuralism kind of starts to dismantle all that. Post-structuralism is a lot about deconstruction. Deconstructionism and post-structuralism go hand in hand. This is where the term deconstructionism kind of comes from and starts to get popular. And then the deconstructionists, it goes into the postmodern, to where instead of asking, let's say like in the times of Plato and Aristotle, like what is the good life, we're going to be asking what kind of systems perpetuate the idea, narrative of the good life. All right, that's deconstructionism, right? Instead of looking forward to an idea, we're kind of tearing down the idea and seeing where the root causes are or who perpetuates notions of that idea and such. So this is, again, a little bit deeper if you want to get more into the philosophy and kind of the background of where postmodernism comes from. Post-structuralism, having an understanding of post-structuralism is a good place to go. This one is one that doesn't get talked about a lot, and it should. I don't know why it doesn't. I tend to forget about it sometimes as well, but this is a pivotal book here. It's The Social Construction of Reality by Berger and Lachman. These are two, I want to say they're sociologists that wrote this book in the 60s. And this was also very much a springboard into postmodernism. When you talk about a lot of gender ideology today and a lot of gender theory, it follows, this book is basically where a lot of that comes from, or a lot of the writers like Butler, Judith Butler, and people of that nature that write about gender theories and such. This is with springboard, kind of the preliminary literature where a lot of those ideas come from. What is the social construction of reality? Well, basically, it's this idea, again, I think, years ago it was more difficult to describe these things to people because they were maybe more foreign and academic. But now when I say that, I don't think that it's really hard to understand anymore because of what we have going on in our culture. So the social construction of reality is basically this kind of relativistic notion that reality is constructed, and reality is constructed on an individual basis, right? So everybody has their own kind of sense of reality. There is no objective reality. Everything is kind of a social construct. If you hear that, I know when I was in college, I definitely heard that term a lot. I think it's more pervasive now. So you probably heard that term, such and such is a construction, as a social construction. It's a social, gender is a social construction. Race is a social construction. The government, society is a social construction. I just want to make one point about that I feel like is very obvious that goes over people's heads sometimes. Something might be a social construction. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's invalid or not valuable. So we want to keep that in mind. But pivotal book, very important. Doesn't get a lot of review for some reason. I think when we talk about these topics, it tends to go to who I'm going to mention in just a second here, and these guys kind of get left behind, but very much, this is very much, at least academically, is very much opened the gates for what we see now today. I think maybe one of the reasons why it doesn't get a lot of review is because Berger and Lachman were just sociologists. They didn't really have a political motive behind writing that book, whereas someone I'm going to talk about here now is the one that really had a lot of political motive. And if you guessed it right. That's Michel Foucault. And this is going to be the debate between Noam Chomsky and Michel Foucault. Noam Chomsky, if you don't know him, he's a linguist at MIT. I believe he's now retired. He's getting up in age. Aside from being a linguist, he talks a lot about foreign affairs and politics. But in the 70s, he did a debate with Michel Foucault. You can actually even get footage of this debate, and you can watch it or you can read it, basically. This is just a transcript of that debate. This is the Chomsky and Foucault debates. Now, this is a really good thing to read or watch if you're just trying to understand the perspective of someone who has a more structuralist view or more objective view or traditional view, which would be Chomsky. And that's not always the case with Chomsky, but in this case it is. As opposed to somebody like Foucault, who has more of a post-structuralist, postmodernist view of the individual. Okay, so if you see the back and forth banter, that'll help you discern really what the critical differences are into the conception of the individual. Because this is what a lot of postmodernism is about, and post-structuralism. It's about how do we conceive of the individual, and then how does the society conceive of the individual? How do citizens conceive of the individual? How do we conceive of ourselves? It's a lot of what postmodernism has to do with. So that debate will clear a lot of that up. So before I cover this one, I'm going to do Lyotard. He is kind of cited by a couple academics that are popular on YouTube. This is the Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge. This one is a little bit more academic. It's a little bit deeper into the philosophical epistemology about postmodernism and kind of where it's coming from, the questions that it's asking and why it's asking them. It's very good. Like I said, it was maybe more academic. It's not as political, but it's a very essential text in this realm because it's one of those that begins to start asking the questions and defining kind of what postmodernism is as it starts to become its own discipline and area and philosophy. Next one is the Michel Foucault Reader. Now, Foucault has a lot of books. I would say there's probably about 3 or 4 that are the most popular, but he has a few books. But the Michel Foucault Reader is just a kind of more inclusive book that compiles a lot of his major work that'll get you to understand where he was coming from. Now, he is basically seen as the darling of postmodernism, along with Jacques Derrida, which was very much a deconstructionist, but he was more into deconstructing language. Michel Foucault was more about narratives and bringing to light the fact that of what he thought how marginalized people became marginalized, why people in the prison system are considered criminals, and why people that are mentally ill are considered mentally ill, and things like that. The main figure, not even one of the main figures, the main figure of postmodernism, Michel Foucault. If you want to get deeper into his writing and understanding, this is it. And of course, you can go from there you can go and pick out particular texts. I do have some of the books that are mentioned in that book that he wrote. So the next book for postmodernism is called Explaining Postmodernism. This one is by Stephen Hicks. Now this is, I want to say, out of all the books that I've mentioned that have an overview of postmodernism, this is the most inclusive, and I would say the easiest to read, the most accessible for maybe someone who's not that well versed in philosophical literature. One reason for that is just because it's not as technical, but he still covers the bases in a technical sense. What I mean by that is he does a good historic analysis, starting really with the Enlightenment, and then takes you all the way back. So all the way to basically first 21st century. So he's starting 1700s all the way up to the 21st century, giving you an understanding, a philosophical understanding of where these ideas came from, and the individuals that kind of brought them about. And he goes on to denote all the problems with them. So he gives a critique as well. So this is a very all-encompassing book. I believe it might be a little bit on the pricier side. A couple of the books I'm going to show you now are a little bit on the pricier side, I guess. But in either case, like I said, this book is pretty much invaluable. It's again the best book to give you the overall sense of postmodernism and give you a good historical analysis of it. So again, if you want to catch up on the last 500 years, 600, 700 years of philosophy, and how it's become what it's become, this is a book that'll get you there. So the next books I'm going to talk about are going to be critiques of postmodernism in a scientific sense. I'm going to start with something of which is very near and dear to my heart, something which I value very much. It's something called the Sokal hoax. So Alan Sokal was a professor in the sciences who, during his stint as a professor, during his tenure, he was in the throes of all the proliferation of postmodern literature. Again, if you're not that well versed in it, postmodernism comes from the humanities. It really comes from a field, not even of philosophy, something called critical theory, which was really something that came out of basically the English department. It's something that came out of the English department and the sociological department. So it came out of sociology and kind of literary criticism is really where postmodernism starts to crop up in, and then it infiltrates other fields, and it infiltrates philosophy, and infiltrates psychology. Then it starts to infiltrate the sciences. Now we see that the most direct manifestation of that we see is all the gender ideology today. Sokal, he was a professor in the sciences that while the postmodern deconstructionist, post-structuralist kind of philosophy started to permeate into the sciences, he was a scientist that started to question this. He was one that was starting to get really perturbed by this. And I love this because I find him as a kindred spirit, and I love what he did. There's a lot of background in this, something I want to talk about in more detail. Again, if you're more academically oriented, you'll really appreciate this, but it's something really to know about. I'm going to cover this in another video because it's one of the most important things that's ever happened in the academy in the last 40 years. This takes place in 1996. So this physics professor, who's perturbed about what's going on in the academy in terms of the proliferation of what he's going to call bad ideas that come from postmodernism into the sciences. He's perturbed about these matters. So what he does is he plays a hoax essentially. He starts writing publications, starts writing articles in the same vein as someone like Michel Foucault, in the same vein as someone like Jacques Derrida. We're using the same kind of language. Again, as you get more familiar with postmodernism, you'll come to understand maybe why some people have an issue with it, because you have to read its literature. It's a literary thing. It has its own lexicon of language essentially. It has a certain way of writing. It's very discursive. So there's a certain literary style, a certain writing style that comes with postmodern writers. So it's not even just what they're saying technically that might be wrong or people that find issue with it, but it's just even a certain style of writing that seems to be very discursive and very vague at times. So Sokal, what he does is he says, well, let's see, because this stuff is getting so popular, he says, well, let's see if I can put this into the sciences. I'm going to take what I'm seeing from Foucault and Derrida and this way of speaking about things, this kind of like this lack of like an objectivity, kind of way of speaking, this way of speaking that's like very, very vague and discursive. Let me see if I can implant some of that language into some of my scientific literature, and let's see if I get it published, even though what I'm saying is actually completely false, and it's either completely false or it doesn't even mean anything. Like I'm not even really saying anything on purpose. I'm purposefully taking their language, their kind of way of speaking. I'm going to implant it into scientific speak, right? I'm going to put it into physics, but I'm not going to talk about real ideas that are actually valid, right? I'm not going to talk about real principles that are actually valid. I'm not going to talk about things that are true. I'm not going to make any true statements here. I'm just going to speak in their language and see if these people eat it up, essentially. I'm going to play a hoax on them to pull the pants down on them, right? It's like to just see how this thing is really going to play out. So I'm going to take their language. I'm going to put, some things of my discipline in there, and act like I'm saying this for real when I'm not, and see how it goes over. And lo and behold, his papers get published. His papers get published, and he comes out with this. It's like it was all a joke. Like this wasn't even true, and like they weren't even able to discern that this was all a hoax. Like this wasn't real literature. Now, what's even more profound about this, in a certain sense, I mean, again, I can encourage you to read the book. It's very important, one of the most important pieces, one of the most important phenomena that's happened in the last 40 years in the academy. But not only that, there's two guys, I want to say they were from the UK, two guys that found out about this and played their own hoax, I believe, when it came to like feminism. So what they did is they were getting perturbed about the radical feminist, kind of third wave feminist kind of ideology that's been going on. And they took the language, not of deconstructionists, but of Hitler's Mein Kampf. And but instead of talking about genocide, he's basically talking about being against men. So instead of being against Jews, they took Mein Kampf, but wrote it in his perspective of being against men, essentially. And they got published. They got published by a few credible publications having to do with gender and women's studies and whatnot. And they played their own hoax about that. And the whole joke was just like, we use Hitler's Mein Kampf to speak against men, and you guys, you verified this and thought of it as good literature. So very important stuff. The next one I'm going to give you is another one. It's called Fashionable Nonsense. It's kind of a follow-up to this. So this is a Sokal hoax. This is Sokal as well, along with another author, where they talk about fashionable nonsense is basically how they sum it up, right? They're two scientists. They're scientists that say, hey, look, this stuff is nonsense, and it's fashionable nonsense, and they break it down. They call it postmodern intellectuals' abuse of science. Okay? Very well worth it. This is what I think the reason why these books are so important is because people get caught up in all the gender and all the race stuff And I think because that stuff tends to have more of a moralistic element, people tend to be more forgiving and gracious to bad ideas or things that don't make any sense. But when you put it in a scientific context, then you can see how absurd a lot of it is. That's why this book, when I encourage you to read these things, it's not just for their literary value or because of the precedents that they set in the last 40 years of academia, but it's also because there's tons and tons of comedic value. I mean, I don't know if I've ever laughed any harder at something than reading this book here, because of the things that he comes up with, the way he talks and speaks about, deconstruction in terms of physics and like astrophysics. It's really funny. It's really funny, the things that he comes up with to kind of elude people to thinking that this is like he's saying these things for real. Like, it's hilarious. The next one, higher superstition. The academic left and its quarrels with science. Again, these are all science related. Another very good book. And again, I'm also showing you this to show you the amount of literature that's out there about this topic. There's even more than this. These are just some that I have found to be very, very well written and address the problems very well. But there's tons of books out there like this. These are just some of the most prominent. A House Built of Sand. Okay, this is another one. Exposing postmodernist myths about science. Okay. Another one worth checking out. I said a lot of these, there's going to be some overlap. I would say between these three, there's a lot of overlap between these three books here. But they're still worth the read. It's still worth understanding. The next two books I'm going to give you are books that have to do with postmodernism read through a theological or Christian lens. So the first one is a primer on postmodernism. Again, not much to say about it. It's just through a Christian lens, which I actually really appreciate. To be honest, another way to kind of really get a grasp of postmodernism, if you really want to get kind of like a real world, I think, understanding of it, is to actually read a book like this, or one that's written through a theologian's perspective, because a theologian is going to have more of a critique having to do with human behavior, rather than just a philosophical or intellectual critique. He's going to say, how has this changed our culture? Joseph Ratzinger, he has very good books, not necessarily postmodernism, but he writes about relativism, which is very much a philosophical component of postmodernism. He wrote, if you don't know, Joseph Ratzinger was Pope Benedict XVI. So he recently passed away. He has a wealth of books that are really accessible, really easy to read, that have to do with relativism, which basically spill over to postmodernism. And I believe he even has a book with Habermas where he goes back and forth with Habermas. So, I mean, again, a lot of these theologians are very intellectual people, and they know what they're talking about. And they have, like I said, what they have on their side is they have a more traditional sense of human behavior. And sometimes they can actually be more honest, right? Because that's the thing that we don't understand sometimes about a lot of the people that we're learning postmodernism from, or postmodern ideas from, are people that agree with it. But sometimes that's not necessarily the best person to get your ideas from. Sometimes you look outside the field sometimes at people that may find issue with it, or have a more holistic view of it. That's actually, even personally, in my academic journey, that's why I actually started to study theology after studying philosophy, is because I found that the theologians just went a little bit deeper. They just went a little bit further in their steps in exploration. And that's partially because when most of the disciplines in the humanities or in the sciences today have become atheistic, then there's just a bunch of questions that they just don't ask anymore, because they assume them already to be answered. But if you read from a theologian's perspective, are still going to ask certain questions and presume that they're relevant, and many times they still are. You see, so a lot of these books on postmodernism, these people are starting from, as you will see with the Stephen Hicks' book, they're starting from prepositions starting in the Enlightenment, when we started to get away from ideas of an omniscient being, a God, essentially. But with that comes a whole bunch of presuppositions about what the world is, who we are, and even who we're trying to make ourselves. Because there's a reason why we wanted to depart from notions of having a higher power that created the world, rather than just thinking that we're just out here and we make ourselves, right? The kind of existential push that happens even before postmodernism is a critical point of how postmodernism got to where it's at. So it becomes, human being as a product of creation rather than human being as a product of their own creation. So very worthwhile to read theologians. They'll give you a really good, well-rounded perspective, a more encompassing perspective. They won't leave out certain questions because they still see them as relevant, whereas a lot of writers in philosophy now, in the social sciences, they're just not going to go as deep because, and not just to say that because they disregard it because of the atheistic bent, but it's also just because it's just out of fashion to ask those questions in the academy. This is an important point. I don't want to get too off topic, but every idea kind of creates a social environment, kind of creates a culture. There's a culture of postmodernism in the academy. There's a culture of feminism in the academy. There's a culture of racial politics in the academy. And that these ideas spawn a culture, and now that culture was going to have, by definition of it being a culture, it's going to have certain boundaries and limitations and restrictions. And this is one thing I think that people that are critical about postmodernism and about ideas in general always want to bring to attention, is that, hey, oh yeah, we want to have these, we don't want to oppress people, and we want to have all these, we want everyone to, we want an egalitarian society, we want this or that. But we have to pay attention to the fact that every system of thought curates a culture, which then curates boundaries, which then isolates somebody in some way, shape, or form. And that's very much what you see in postmodern critiques and critiques about gender ideology and critiques about race ideology, is that they are set forth to be all-inclusive, but it's just somebody else that starts to get marginalized, someone with a different perspective, someone with a different story, someone with a different background. So these all-encompassing ideologies that are said to be, universal, always tend to subsist into something that draws boundaries and marginalization, whether the people that are proponents of it choose to acknowledge it. And that's become the major problem in the academy today, is that there are these boundaries, there is that level of exclusion. It's very heavy against, religious ideas. There's a lot of questions we don't ask anymore that are relevant to the literature, that are relevant to academia, that are relevant to the sciences, that we don't ask anymore because we feel like we already know the answers or just want to go a certain way, a certain path. And so it becomes unpopular to even ask those questions inside those realms. Which then, again, what's the question there? The question is, or what's the discrepancy there? The discrepancy is, well, are we doing good work then? Are we doing a thorough work if we're only asking certain questions predicated upon the paradigm that we're operating in this specific instance, given the philosophical milieu that we're participating in? Or are we still doing academic justice? Doing academic justice would mean going back and reviewing ideas of the past, whether or not we agree with them, right? Because of their relevance in asking certain questions. Truth decay. And this is a very good jumping off point to what I'm just saying here. Truth decay. This is exactly what this book is going to cover. This is just another book, Christianity Postmodernism from a Christian perspective, defending Christianity against the challenges of postmodernism. But it's all in the title there. So it kind of exactly what I'm talking about, meaning, and I'm not saying that Christianity is the truth, religion is the truth. That's not what I mean. But what I'm saying is, if you have that kind of environment of where you can't acknowledge and ask certain questions, which has very much come out of the field of postmodernism, then you're not really getting to as much truth as you think you're getting to. There's potential for you to be missing things because we're not asking holistic questions, because we only want to look through a certain perspective, just because that's what the discipline is built on. So there we have it. Got about 13 books that cover postmodern philosophy. We have it starting from the Oxford Press with the introductory books. You read some Michel Foucault, the debates on Chomsky and Foucault. Again, a great one for an introduction to the debate. You can either watch it or read it. Then we have our Explaining Postmodernism by Stephen Hicks, really all-inclusive volume that'll show you the history. It's not too academic for you to understand. Then we have, Sokol, again, the hoax is excellent, very prominent event that take place in the academy. Very important to know about. I will be doing a follow-up video on that in the near future. And like I said, we're going to be doing some more of this. We're going to be taking a deep dive probably into some of this literature and just philosophy in general. I kind of want to get back to the roots of philosophy, essentially, which is why I try not to spend too much time on postmodernism. I want to get back to the roots of philosophy and studying some, canonical philosophical literature and seminal works. So again, this is at the Symposium. Thank you for watching.